morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Oh, nice to see so many bodhisattvas in one room.
Do you need a clock?
I have today, thank you. I usually forget. Today I remembered. Okay. So as Hoshin mentioned, today, finally, we get to gate 109 of the 108 gates. Somehow there's one more. The state in which water is sprinkled on the head is a gate of dharma-illumination. For with it, following birth in a family, we are at last able to realize anuttara-samyak-sambodhi. So, we finally at last reach the final gate of dharma-illumination. So this is the end of the story that we started a couple of gates ago. We've been going along for the last couple of gates, sort of finishing the story. So the two kanji being translated here as the state in which water is sprinkled on the head, are sometimes read as consecration, right? They literally mean pouring something on the head, which seems maybe a little unusual. So you'll recall at gate 108, we learned that in Japanese the ceremonial sprinkling is kancho or kanjo, right? So it's a term that comes from the Sanskrit, abhisheka, we learned last time. It's older than Buddhism. It's also part of the Hindu tradition, so it goes way, 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 way back. So abhisheka is a religious ritual in which you pour a liquid offering over an image of a deity, or something like that, while chanting, probably. So in the esoteric Buddhist traditions, this ceremonial water sprinkling goes with some kind of initiation. Maybe you're conferring the precepts, maybe you're doing dharma transmission, maybe it's simply protection from disaster, or preparation for the next life. So the symbolism is transferring the Tathagata's wisdom to somebody, right? The water is a metaphor for this wisdom of awakening. So we're pouring this wisdom of awakening onto something or somebody. But this is not the only kind of consecration possible, this kind of water sprinkling or pouring, right? There is also, Buddha can lay his hand on the head of a disciple, which is a sort of consecration. Buddha can make an oral prediction of somebody's future enlightenment. And a couple of gates ago, we spent an entire morning talking about that, predictions of Buddhahood, right? Buddha can also sort of emit light for the benefit of beings. You read about this in sutras. Buddha will get ready to do some teaching or preaching, or he's speaking to his disciples, and he will emit light in all directions, right? So this too is part of this consecration. So all of these are the same kanji for kanjo, even though there's no actual pouring on the head in the case of all of these kinds of consecration. So we spent enough time on abhisheka at gate 108 that our time is better spent today considering this phrase, birth in a family. Here's this dharma gate, so that following birth in a family, something can happen. We realize anuttara-samyak-sambodhi. So again, in Buddhist cosmology, there's this special realm for bodhisattvas who are at the final stage of their path, just before becoming Buddhas. They're up in Tushita heaven, right? They're waiting for the last chapter. They've done everything they need to do. This is the end of the line. So when their karma is finished playing out, the next stop is Buddhahood, right? They're that close, that close. So bodhisattvas like Maitreya, which is the next Buddha, are waiting there. They're looking for the right opportunity to be reborn in the world. So this four kanji phrase, translated here as birth in a family, has two interesting parts, I think, that aren't obvious from the English translation. The first two mean to come forth, or to appear, but the sense is something is appearing through taking on life, or coming to life. And the last two are shukkei. Guess what? Shukkei is the same as shukkei tokudo, leaving home and becoming a member of the ordained sangha. So anybody's wearing one of these has done shukkei tokudo. It's the same shukkei. So the sense of this is not just being reborn in a human family and sort of living out a normal life as a farmer or a merchant or a business person or a teacher or something, a parent. There's someone who takes on human form, enters into the human realm among these 6 realms of samsara, right? There's more than one realm, so it's the human realm, and at some appropriate time ordains as a home leaver, makes a life commitment to the Dharma. So there's a particular path in this human realm that this being needs to take. So these are very specific karmic circumstances that are leading up to realizing anuttara-samyak-sambodhi, complete perfect enlightenment. So this bodhisattva has received a prediction of Buddhahood from a Buddha. Some Buddha somewhere has said, you will be Buddha. So this bodhisattva is now at the highest stage. has reached Tushita heaven after lifetime after lifetime after lifetime of practice. You don't just end up there, you got to practice to get there. This bodhisattva knows after one more life, Buddhahood is the next stop. He's poised on that threshold, right, waiting for rebirth. So now he can't just be born anywhere in any realm. If he's going to achieve Buddhahood, it has to be within the human realm of samsara. So if he's reborn in some other heaven realm, he's eventually going to use up the merit that he accumulated that got him there, right? He's going to be reborn in some lower realm of samsara. So heaven realm is not the be-all and end-all. If he's born in an animal realm or a hell realm, well, there's no incentive to practice, no opportunity to practice. There's so many obstacles to practice, right? That's why it's a hell realm. That's why it's a lower realm. So the only way to get to Buddhahood is from the human realm, complete with suffering and delusion and all the obstacles and hindrances and things we encounter, but also full of dharma gates, full of opportunities to practice, right? At least 109 dharma gates. But we'll see there's many more. So, as Dogen says toward the end of the Fukanza Zengi, you've gained the pivotal opportunity of human form. Do not pass your days and nights in vain, right? Saying practice while you have the chance. Practice while you have this human form. This is your opportunity to realize something, right? To become Buddha. So not only does this bodhisattva have to be born in a human realm, he has to encounter Buddha's teachings, he has to encounter the Dharma, right? He has to decide to practice, and he has to be so committed that he leaves his human family, takes these lifelong vows, enters the Sangha, right? Becomes a committed, devoted practitioner. So he takes the precepts in a ceremony that points to, guess what? Abhisheka, water being sprinkled on the head. Anybody here who's wearing a raksu, you'll remember that part of the precept ceremony, right? We're putting water on your head. So, leaves behind all the distractions of worldly life, focuses completely on the Buddha way. So gives up the job, gives up the family responsibilities in traditional times, right? Really moves into wholehearted practice with the Sangha as your entire life. So from here, this bodhisattva's karma continues to play out until it's exhausted, but he's already attained prajna, or great wisdom. Now, what is realizing anuttara-samyak-sambodhi, right? It means attaining supreme, perfect, complete enlightenment. So when you've done this, now you're a Buddha. So this complete, perfect enlightenment is considered the highest of the three forms of enlightenment. So guess what? There's not just one. There's several forms of enlightenment, at least three. So the other two are focused on attaining awakening either by yourself or for yourself, right? Because the practitioner doesn't understand emptiness and interconnectedness. It's a self-directed kind of practice. I'm going to get something for me. I'm going to do this all by myself, and I'm going to have some kind of peak experience, and I'm going to have some kind of awakening for my own liberation. So, these bodhisattvas are very mature, experienced practitioners. They've been around a while. We've just said they practice lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. They thoroughly understand the Four Noble Truths. They thoroughly understand the chain of causality. But they're practicing for their own liberation, so they can't liberate others. They are considered to be kind of at a lower level than bodhisattvas or Buddhas. So these are, the beings that are focused on the other two kinds of enlightenment, right? For self or by self. So bodhisattvas understand emptiness through their own practice and through their own personal insight, their own personal experience, right? They've done the hard graft. They've put themselves on the cushion. So they really understand from their own insight, from their own experience, what emptiness is about. They see that conditioned things are empty of a permanent, fixed self-nature, right? This is what emptiness is. Doesn't mean things don't exist. It means they don't have a fixed self-nature. So these bodhisattvas have been able to resolve ignorance because they can see reality accurately as it is. They see the entire picture. They see all of it. They've eliminated the obstacles and the hindrances to wisdom that result in unskillful action, deluded action, right? Things that create suffering. So on that basis then, bodhisattvas practice not for themselves, but in order to help others to practice, in order to enable practice for other beings. So they aspire that everybody should cross over before they do, right? Everyone should go before me. So that's the difference. The bodhisattvas are not practicing solely for self. So out of compassion, they share their wisdom with others in order to lift others out of samsara. and lead them toward liberation from suffering. So that means they're out there talking about the Four Noble Truths and making people understand suffering and the cause of suffering and how it ceases to be and how that actually happens, how we actually do that. That wisdom and understanding, again, comes from their own practice and their own complete, perfect enlightenment, right? Their own anuttara-samyak-sambodhi. They're not just sort of repeating what they heard Buddha say. They're not just repeating what they read someplace, right? Repeating a sutra that they heard someplace, right? This is their own real, very direct experience. So this is exactly what Buddha did in his manifestation, right? As Nirmanakaya, as a human teacher in the world. The historical Buddha that we know as Shakyamuni, right? He took up the problem of human suffering. He tried various ways of spiritual practice in order to understand that, right? He had a really deep question, like, what is this human suffering about? I'm seeing things around me that I don't understand. What is the root cause? So as a young adult, of course, he has a series of insights into the nature of suffering and the nature of reality, and those insights come from his own discernment, from his own practice. So, no mysterious beings came to him and sort of handed him enlightenment, or handed him an understanding, some kind of magical knowledge, right? So after that, he spent the rest of his life until he was an old man traveling around, teaching the Dharma, sharing what he learned, helping other people to practice and to work toward their own liberation, so they in turn could help others, right? We're starting a chain of events. So we can see why the Bodhisattva in Tushita heaven needs to be born into this human realm of samsara and encounter the Dharma and commit to actually practicing. Simply to hang around in a heaven realm is never going to get us there. We actually have to be in the human world, doing the practice, coming to understanding, liberating other beings. So next stop, Buddhahood. This is how we get there. So we usually refer to the Buddha, right? And we usually mean Shakyamuni when we say that, but in the Mahayana there can be many, many Buddhas. We're not limited to one Buddha. If you attain complete perfect enlightenment and you lead others to the same kind of insight that you've had, then you are a Buddha. You are an awakened one. You are doing the work of Buddha in the world. So in our tradition, there are three kinds of three treasures, of course. We hear about this frequently. That means there are three kinds of Buddha treasure, right? So Dogen describes them in the Kyoto Kaimon. We hear this every 30 days when we do Rakusatsu. We hear about the three kinds of three treasures. So for each of the three treasures, there's a manifesting version, and there's a maintaining version, and there's an absolute version, right? So when it comes to Buddha, we have the manifesting Buddha treasure. This is the historical Buddha, right? This is Shakyamuni. The human being who had an awakening experience, wandered around teaching the Dharma to his own Sangha and to other beings. There's the maintaining Buddha treasure, so these are the Buddha figures that we encounter today, which might be statues or pictures or other representations of Buddha that support our practice and our aspiration. Sometimes it's also teachers, right? People who are representing the Buddha, carrying out the Buddha's teaching. We also have the absolute Buddha treasure, so this is awakening itself, right? Wisdom itself, not contained within a being that appears or disappears, right? This is enlightenment as it fully exists. So the absolute Buddha treasure really includes everything, right? The absolute Dharma as the truth of reality, the absolute Sangha as peaceful and harmonious functioning. So the absolute Buddha we actually can't really separate from the other three treasures, from the other treasure. So the state in which water is sprinkled on the head is a gate of dharma-illumination. For with it, following birth in a family, we are at last able to realize anuttara-samyak-sambodhi. I think the word realize here is important. Not realize as in understand. Oh, I realize I made a mistake or something like that, right? This is realize as in make real. We make real this anuttara-samyak-sambodhi. So we gain the pivotal opportunity of human form. We're born in a family, we practice, we get in touch with our own awakening, with our own Buddha nature, and now that awakening is real. It's not our idea, it's not some potential for something that's going to happen another day, or it's going to happen somewhere else. Right here. So we're moving through the concrete world with an actual body and mind, as challenging as sometimes that is. We're carrying out actions that affect others and affect our environment as well as ourselves. So there's no separation there. That we're kind of setting subsequent causes and conditions in motion to produce results of some kind. And suddenly the Dharma stops being something we read about and think about and hear a Dharma talk about and debate, right? Practice stops being something we'll get to at some point when we have time, when we feel like it, right? We see that our whole lives and all of our activities with this body and mind are practice. They are manifestations of awakening. We have realized something, made it real. So Buddha is no longer the Bodhisattva protector of illumination. Just remember when he's sitting up there in Tushita heaven, waiting for rebirth, he's the Bodhisattva protector of illumination. So he's no longer sitting up there in some kind of an ephemeral heaven realm, waiting somewhere to be born, to manifest, to be, realized. He's right here. We're living his life. He's arrived, though he's never actually left. Right? He's already here. So the path to realizing Buddhahood is exactly these 108 gates we've been talking about, or I've been talking about for 80 years. We've covered conduct of body, speech, and mind. We've covered the 6 kinds of mindfulness, the 4 Brahma Viharas, the 4 Dharma seals, the 37 LB, the 4 abodes of mindfulness, the 5 faculties, the 5 powers, the Eightfold Path, the 6 paramitas, and many other gates that don't actually fall into a nice, neat list. Right? We've covered the waterfront. So, in other words, practice in the world is how we realize awakening. And all these 108 gates are descriptions of that. So Bodhisattva, protector of illumination, tells his audience that he's preaching these 108 gates as his last instructions to them so that they will remember him before he descends to the earth and kind of does his last hurrah, right? So he creates a setting so unbelievably magnificent that it convinces all the other beings that what he has to say is going to be better than anything else that's going on, right? Better than anything else they have in the world of desire or the world of samsara, because this heaven realm is, it's not somewhere else. It's actually part of this samsaric world, right? So he's created this magnificent setting so that everybody will pay attention. Oh, that's way better and more interesting than what I'm doing over here, right? He wants to attract all the beings to where he is. So Dogen includes this list in the 12-fascicle version of his Shobogenzo, and at the end he says, this is what bodhisattvas in Tushita heaven do. They proclaim this teaching. And they talk about these Dharma gates without fail before they appear in the world, right? They get everyone together and they preach these 108 gates before they descend to the human realm. Dogen says, however, the students who have known them clearly are few, and those who do not know them are as common as rice, flax, bamboo, and reeds. So although this gets preached every single time a bodhisattva leaves Tushita heaven, somehow we still don't get it. He's saying you still need to be looking at these gates and practicing these gates. So even though this teaching is always given, even though these Dharma gates are essentials for our practice, I mean, goodness, look at the things I just said we covered. The Eightfold Path, the Four Noble Truths, right? These are just the most basic teachings we have. He says, even though these are constantly preached, and even though some of these things are the most basic parts of our practice, somehow we still don't have it. We still don't get it. So he says, Dogen goes on to say, he's including them there for the benefit of beginners and senior students. So even if we've been practicing a long time, even if we've heard this teaching before, multiple times maybe, doesn't mean we completely understand it, right? There's no end to this practice. There's no end point. There's no, today I'm done, right? Somehow there's always something else we can investigate. So Dogen's last 4 sentences after this list. Those who would ascend the lion's seat and become the teachers of human beings and gods should painstakingly learn them in practice. Without having lived in this Tushita heaven as a bodhisattva bound by one life, we are not Buddhas at all. Practitioners, do not be proud of yourselves at random. For a bodhisattva bound by one life, there is no intermediate stage. So the lion's seat, of course, is wherever Buddha is sitting. So it might be an elaborate, jewel-encrusted throne, if that's what's going to make his point, right? If that's going to attract everybody's attention. Could be something opulent. Could be the bare ground he's sitting on. Because we know in his life, right, he was a humble guy. Maybe put down a grass mat, sat down someplace and started preaching the Dharma. That too is the lion's seat, or the lion throne, right? Whenever he sits down and starts teaching, we hear something called the lion's roar. You might be familiar with this phrase, the lion's roar. Lion's roar is simply Buddha teaching the Dharma. It's another name for Dharma in the sense of what Buddha taught. So if we want to sit in the place of the Buddha, on his grass mat or on his throne, and teach the Dharma to people and gods, then we should painstakingly learn these gates in practice. In other words, as our own experience. Not just what somebody says. Not just what I tell you, not just what you read in a book, right? This has to be your own personal experience. It has to be part of you in order to completely transmit that dharma, teach that dharma, preach that dharma to other beings and liberate other beings. So without having lived in Tushita heaven as bodhisattvas, with only one more life to go before Buddhahood, we aren't Buddhas at all. So remember, these bodhisattvas have practiced life after life after life, maybe 500 lives, right? Many, many lifetimes, and that's where their insights come from. That's how they've gained wisdom, compassion, skillful action, able to see clearly the way Buddha sees. That's why non-reliance is a key element of our practice here at Sanshin, right? Nobody can practice for us. We have to walk on our own legs, right? Do our own practice. No one can just give us awakening. So we need to investigate these gates in whatever way that looks like for us. We can't investigate them all at one time. Whatever it is that our practice looks like falls somewhere in these 108 gates. We have to do it ourselves and completely have our own understanding and our own insights if we're going to liberate beings. Otherwise, it's just our idea, right? So now we've been through 108 or 109 Dharma gates. What exactly is a Dharma gate? That's an important question. After 109 of these things, like what exactly is a Dharma gate, right? Certainly we get an image of passing through some kind of opening or over some kind of threshold from one condition, one set of circumstances to another. There's some kind of transition happening. And indeed, Buddha's teaching is regarded as the entry to awakening. If we don't encounter Buddha's teaching, it's very difficult, maybe impossible, to actually manifest awakening, come to awakening. So if we can go through all these gates, we find ourselves, according to this last gate, we find ourselves in the middle of complete, unsurpassed, perfect enlightenment. So for each instance of human delusion, Buddha is said to have had a method for dealing with it. For each instance of our sort of making mistakes, having the wrong idea, being sort of caught up in something, Buddha has a method for teaching our practice for dealing with that. That number is 84,000. There are 84,000. There are supposed to be 84,000 delusions, right? So there are supposed to be 84,000 Dharma gates. Now, 84,000 is simply another way to say myriad, right? Uncountable numbers. A huge number of some kind, right? So for all the kinds of human delusion there are exactly that many Dharma gates. Every time we fall prey to something, three poisonous mind or some other kind of delusion, there is something we can do to resolve it, to turn it around. So this list has 108 because, as we saw back at gate 36, 108 is an important number in this tradition, right? It said that there are 108 bonno, 108 afflictions or delusions to overcome to reach nirvana. So sometimes you visit a temple or a shrine, there are 108 steps up to the shrine. Or, which might be 2 sets of 54, 3 sets of 36, but there's 108, right? 108 steps toward nirvana. So in Japan at the New Year, the temple bell rings 108 times, right? Once for each of these delusions, releasing us from each of these delusions, and sort of a protection practice, right? So shikuhaku is an expression meaning to be in dire distress, right? To have difficulty. It represents the sufferings that we have in our life. It has the same sound as 4, 9, 8, 9. Shikuhaku, right? So if you add up 4 times 9 and 8 times 9, turns out to equal 108. So this is a play on words, right? Shikuhaku. So shikuhaku, as in 108 gates, or 108 bells, or steps, helps you get rid of shikuhaku, life suffering, right? So, play on words. Physical act of ringing a bell 108 times, walking up 108 steps is a kind of body practice to symbolically eliminate each one of these kinds of delusion, even though we know human delusion is endless. Probably there's more than 108. But in any event, as we say, when we chant the 4 vows, Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. So we encounter Dharma gates all the time. Homon muryo seigan gaku. So what does that mean in our day-to-day practice? How do we practice with Dharma gates? We can consider any challenge that arises in our life as a Dharma gate, right? An opportunity to practice. So, what do I do in the face of conflict in my relationship? Maybe I have some illness or some injury, stuff's going wrong on my work project or my craft project or whatever I'm doing. Maybe I'm losing my keys or spilling my tea, right? We've all got things, sufferings in our lives, challenges in our lives. I'm up against some kind of block. I'm up against some kind of limitation, right? Something is getting in the way of something I want to do or have or something. So it's an opportunity for discernment that leads us to skillful action. Skillful action is something that's in accord with the Dharma or in accord with the true reality of this moment. Like, how can we see clearly what we need to do in that moment that's not just a product of the imagination? So I use the word discernment on purpose. Anyone who knows me knows I use the word discernment a lot. I talk about discernment all the time. I don't mean just sort of figuring out what to do, right? So in a Christian context, discernment might mean I'm going to be quiet and hear what God has to say to me, right? Or what God has to say about the situation. And in our tradition, we're doing something a little different. We're not exactly doing that. It might be more like I'm going to sit still and see with prajna. I'm going to see the way Buddha sees, right? Seeing the way to go forward without the hindrances of self-clinging and three poisons and all the things that get in our way, right? When we sit, when we face the wall, or even if we just sit quietly or walk quietly, let things settle, right? Open the hand of thought. Oh, I can see clearly now, and the way might be a little more evident to me. How do I move forward in a way that doesn't create suffering? If it doesn't liberate beings, at least it doesn't create more suffering, right? How do I calmly, quietly see that? Do that kind of discernment. So it's one thing to read a lot of books about Buddhism, even to sit a lot of zazen. Another to take that practice into the world. I sometimes say to people, don't check your zazen at the door. How do we take that out of the books, off the cushion, out of the zendo, right, into the world? As the basis of how we see things, how we decide what we're actually going to do with this karmic body and mind. So going through a Dharma gate doesn't mean I'm going to go look up what to do. It means experiencing the reality of this moment with your whole karmic being from a practice point of view. How do I bring my practice to this? How do I remember to practice, right? What is mindfulness for us? Remembering what Buddha taught, right? It's remembering to practice. So how do I take that Dharma gate mindfully? In other words, how do I bring my practice to this? How do I not forget to practice in the midst of stubbing my toe, losing my keys, right? Or something which is really major. So, good news is, there is no Dharma gate that is not an opportunity for practice, right? There is no challenge we have, no matter how small, no matter how large. It's not a Dharma gate. It's not an opportunity for us to see the way Buddha sees, do something skillful, right? Bring our practice to that moment. The resolution might not be what the small self wants in the midst of that Dharma gate. Sometimes we kind of don't want to see with the eyes of Buddha because, like, I don't want to do that. I want to do this thing that reinforces my self-concept. Even though I know, it's not exactly the right, but that feels better, so we're going to do that, right? The resolution of that challenge, that Dharma gate, might be something other than what we expect or what the small self might want. But, there's some even small amount of being freed from suffering. If we can at least bring our Buddha eye to that, at least we can see what needs to happen. There's some small liberation from suffering. And every so often that resolution comes when we realize, oh, here's this Dharma gate in front of me. Here's this challenge in front of me. I created it. Nobody put that Dharma gate in front of me. That's something I created. It's because I'm stuck somewhere. It's because I'm not seeing clearly. It's because I have an attachment to something. I'm caught up in the three poisons. Oh, here pops up this Dharma gate, right? So it can be a signal. There's some hindrance here. There's something going on. I'm feeling challenged. Here's my opportunity to practice, right? But it's not like some evil being put that gate in front of me. Probably came from here. So sometimes the resolution comes when we can realize, I built that gate. I can take it down. Or I can move through it, or I can resolve it myself, right? So, sometimes we set up some expectation. Universe chooses not to meet that expectation. Universe never promised us a free ride or an easy time. Sometimes we feel like it's not fair. Things shouldn't be this way. Somebody broke a promise to me, right? I had this contract with the universe that I should never have any suffering, and somehow that contract got broken. Well, wait a minute. Nobody signed that contract, right? That's my idea. So, I maybe had some expectation, and that's why there's this Dharma gate, right? Now, the immediate problem isn't, how do I get this thing that I've been prevented from getting. It's how do I understand how I created those assumptions, how I'm caught up in that delusion, how I got swept away by the three poisons. That's now the challenge. It's not so much how do I get through the gate to get to the cherry pie, right? It's why do I think the cherry pie is critical? So I get to do some discernment about that, right? So was there really a gate there? Or did I set that gate up? Which doesn't negate the value of the Dharma gate as a chance to develop some insight, but somebody didn't put it there and somebody else can't unlock it. If it's my Dharma gate, guess what? I'm the one who has to deal with it. I'm the one who has to go through it. I'm the one who has to practice with it. Nobody can do it for me. That doesn't mean teachers, Sangha, friends, books, whatever, can't help point the way, but nobody can truly unlock that gate. We have to unlock it, move through it, right, on our own legs. So yes, these things are opportunities. These Dharma gates, these challenges are opportunities, and in that way, they're our friends, although they might not feel like it at the time. But that doesn't mean we need to convince ourselves we should enjoy them or be grateful for them. And sometimes we so want to make things okay that even something that feels painful, even something that feels challenging, we're going to tell ourselves a story, well, that's for my own good. Even though there's this terrible thing in my life that's causing me suffering, well, you know, I'm going to make it okay by saying, I'm somehow going to convince myself I'm grateful for that thing because it's going to give me an opportunity to practice, right? When we do that, it's just another set of ideas about what's going on and about what our practice is, about who we are. We don't need to have an opinion, right? We don't need to make things okay. Here's a Dharma gate. I don't need to make that okay. I need to look at it carefully. I need to practice with it. I don't need to write a story about what it means, right? Nobody wants suffering. The human condition is nobody wants suffering. So we don't need to tell ourselves a story about, well, you know, I'm really grateful for that fight I had. It taught me something, even though maybe it did teach me something. So if I say, well, you know, I really appreciate that car accident the other week, or, you know, my sprained ankle, or the disagreement that broke out at the board meeting, or whatever it is, right? Because that was a real Dharma gate for me. And I've heard people say this, like, throughout my Zen career. I can just feel them trying so hard to make that challenge okay. And I think we do that because we have this impulse about picking and choosing, right? And not wanting to come down on the side of what is good and bad, right? I think we're really desperately, with a lot of sincerity, trying to free ourselves from the idea that I'm going to label things as bad or they're bad for me. And so instead we go the other way. Oh, this was good for me, right? We're still picking and choosing. We're still having an opinion, right? There's still discriminative thinking happening there, right? So, you know, I love the fact that, you know, this terrible thing happened to me because it was a real Dharma gate. Not necessary, right? It's just another opinion. It's just another story. So if we never resolve what that gate means, if we never kind of get through that gate and completely resolve that challenge, that's not failure. Because if we think it is, that's simply my own idea again. If I don't completely resolve this gate to my satisfaction, somehow I failed in my practice, right? There's plenty of stuff we're never going to resolve. Human suffering is never going away, right? Four Noble Truths tell us being alive in this body means that there are Dharma gates. We're never going to resolve them all. That's part of the Bodhisattva vow, right? So I think we need to be careful about setting up those gates as yardsticks. Oh, I successfully got through that challenge, therefore, you know, something about me, right? So our practice is never complete. We never come to the end of it. This is why we have vow and repentance, right? We vow in this moment to go through all those Dharma gates, those uncountable number of challenging Dharma gates. I vow to get through them all, and yet, we know we can't. Maybe we don't get through one gate completely. Maybe we don't get through all the myriad gates there are. That doesn't make us failures as bodhisattvas. That doesn't mean our practice is meaningless. It is the activity of doing the discernment, doing the practice with the gates that is valuable, worthwhile, meaningful, right? So one interesting thing the 108 gates show us is the Dharma gates are not actually always unpleasant events. So I've characterized them here as these terrible challenges, these hurdles that come up in our life, right? But if you look at the 108 gates we've been through in the last 8 years, they are not all terrible, painful things. We've had things like benevolence. We've had things like joy, stillness, mindfulness, truth on this list. It might not be easy to manifest them in our daily lives. The Dharma gate might be, I don't know how to do this joy thing. I don't know how to manifest compassion in my life, right? But those things themselves are not painful, right? It might not be easy to do them, but they don't present us with this kind of acute suffering that we want to overcome. And yet, there's still opportunities to practice. If we have an aspiration, if our bodhicitta is putting us on the cushion, we have an aspiration to be like Buddha, right? We have an aspiration to manifest all of these things, truth and beauty and joy and wonderful things. That's still a challenge. It's still an opportunity to practice. So we can learn something from experiencing kind speech, clear beliefs, good sangha relationships, right? All of those things are dharma gates. We can experience something just as meaningful from that as we can when things are not going well and the gates in front of us are kind of painful. So the challenge there may be to remember to practice in those moments when things are not challenging us. Sometimes we turn to our practice when we're not feeling so good. I better go sit today because, man, I'm really feeling distracted. Well, wait a minute, what? Right? We have to remember to practice when those dharma gates are not painful. Sometimes we simply just fall back on practice to try to, alleviate our suffering. Well, yes, and. So it's not the whole story. But dharma gates called balance, wisdom, generosity, right, diligence, they also move us toward embodying awakening, realizing awakening. So whatever we're experiencing is a dharma gate, right? Because every single moment is a dharma gate. Every single moment is practice. So somehow there's 108 on this list, but every single moment, more than 84,000 dharma gates, right? Moment by moment by moment. So we've traveled through 108 of them together over the past 8 years. And I think now it's time to go out and find the other 83,900 and some. So what would you like to say this morning about water sprinkled on the head, dharma gates in general, 108 gates in whatever form they appear for you, or anything that's on your mind? I'm going to start in the room, and then we'll go to people at home. Comments, questions, reflections from anybody?
I got a loaded one.
Okay, fire away.
Well, I mean, everything sounds well and good with dharma gates. On the mental side, you can think, you can discern, you can go, oh, dharma gate. But we as human beings have this thing called a body and a boatload of karma. And it's a boatload of karma on multiple levels, one of which is trauma. There are times when someone suffers, it takes a lot to realize that you're suffering. Like one time when I was depressed, I was complaining to a friend that I wasn't really sure what to eat, and she's like, "You're depressed." I'm like, "Oh crap, I'm depressed. I did not know." And there are other levels of trauma which are more horrifying than that. But they leave deep-seated karmic reactions in you that have you react to the world in a different, not so helpful way. How, within our practice, I would not tell someone, "Oh, you have trauma? Sit." No, I would not do that to them.
Right.
I would beg them to seek help, and then later try to sit. So what would you suggest for people with trauma and dharma gates and that deep-seated karma that we all carry?
Well, you're right. I would not say to somebody, Zazen will cure all your problems, because we know Zazen is good for nothing, so we can't use it in a kind of therapeutic way. There are people for whom Zazen is contraindicated, right? There are people who should not be sitting Zazen. So you're right. I would not start there. Somebody who has a background that's traumatic needs particular kinds of help, which the Sangha is not necessarily prepared to provide, right? So that has to be a part of it. If there are some Dharma teachings which can help somebody to very slowly, carefully see this moment as it is, there may be ways to incorporate that, to begin to investigate that, right? But I would do that very, very carefully. And I think that's, it's important that we recognize, it's important that Dharma teachers recognize our limitations. I'm not trained as a healthcare professional. There are plenty of Dharma teachers who are, and actually I think that's harder because which hat are you wearing? Talking to somebody, right? I think that's kind of hard. So I'm always really careful to say there are things that I can't help people with. But if we just consider that, the Dharma, if we consider the Dharma in the largest possible sense, it's the way the world works, right? I mean, it's what Buddha taught, but it's the way the world works. So there are 84,000 or more, I think, opportunities we have to see this reality very clearly, but there are people who need to do that very carefully to avoid re-triggering, re-injuring. They need people who can help them do that in a certain way, right? So I think you're right, it's entirely possible to have trauma of which we are not aware. And part of seeing clearly and part of understanding these 5 skandhas and paying attention to this karmic body and mind. The karmic body and mind can point us in some ways toward the reality that we kind of don't want to recognize. Because we always say, job 1 for the bodhisattva is don't look away from suffering, but golly, that's not so easy when it's your own, So I think you're raising something important. I would not blanketly say, everything's a dharma gate and we should happily sail through them all, kind of going forward on our own legs without help. That's not the point I want to make. And actually, in that way, I'm glad you brought that up, right? We need help sometimes to practice skillfully with dharma gates. We have to do the work. No one can do it for us, but we're not alone in that, right? That's what 3 treasures are for in some ways. So yes, if we need help, we need to get help. We absolutely do. Do you have something more you want to say about that?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
All right. Other comments, questions, reflections about dharma gates, practicing with dharma gates? Please, Chris.
Could you give just rerun through what discernment means to us in our practice? It slipped my mind a little bit. I remember you mentioning like a cherry pie in the dharma gate. So if you could just say that again, I would appreciate it.
Sure. Well, I mean, folks here are laughing because they know cherry pie is like, I love cherry pie. So if I'm going to use some desirable object, it's going to be a cherry pie or a chocolate cake, right? Okay, so discernment. So I like the word discernment because I don't think we 100% do it with the intellect. You can do it that way. One definition of just the word is you're doing discernment. You're trying to analyze something or figure something out. But I think we do that with body and mind, right? So I talk about discernment a lot with folks who are considering ordination, for instance, because I want them to think carefully about what do they feel called to do, right? What would they be doing as ordained sangha that they can't do as lay people? We want to ask ourselves those kinds of questions, and I don't think that's just an intellectual exercise, right? So when I'm thinking about discernment sort of broadly, what that means to me is how do we practice in a way that enables us to see clearly, not being pulled off course by 3 poisonous minds and the delusions that come from 3 poisonous minds. Because as soon as we're sort of pulled off course and we're writing a lot of stories and we don't understand the nature of self, we're not actually seeing reality as it is. We're seeing our idea of reality as it is. So discernment is like, how do we get through that fog, right? And see the way Buddha sees. And see reality for what it is. Being completely aware of our own filters and our own background and our own stuff, because we can't not be aware of that. We don't want to ignore that or suppress it. But that's not the whole story. So how do we see the whole story, right? How does the fog lift a little bit, right? Because what comes out of that is, how do I help liberate other beings? How do I act skillfully in the world in such a way that A, I'm not perpetuating suffering, and B, perhaps I'm lifting people up from suffering, because that's the bodhisattva life, right? And if we're practicing, that's what we're aiming at. How do we help others to practice? So, in a nutshell, to me, discernment is about getting to that kind of clarity. But it's not just, I'm going to have clarity so that I can see something and then stop. It's how do I have clarity so that I can move through the world as a bodhisattva and move through the world with the wisdom and compassion that I need to lift beings out of suffering or help them, right? Lift themselves out of suffering. Is that enough about that?
Yes.
Okay? Yeah, so I threw the cherry pie in there and that was a bit of a rabbit hole. What would others like to say or ask? Please.
So back to the first question about trauma and stuff. As someone with trauma myself that affects how my brain reacts to things, being involved in the sangha is very therapeutic for that. Like, I have daily feel anxiety, the more I'm involved, the better that gets it. I'm better at handling that.
Well, and you know, I think one of the reasons Sangha is important, right, is that we get to practice in a container with other people who are doing that practice, right? So we're all headed the same direction. So I do think we have support among Sangha members because we are all trying to engage in right speech, right action, right thinking, right? We're all trying to see the way Buddha sees. So I'm glad that you're feeling supported in your practice by being with other practitioners, because there's something that happens, I think, here that we may not encounter so readily outside in the world, because, you know, we're all trying to live the way Buddha lived. And, you know, not everybody does. So certainly engaging with Sangha can be a huge support for practice, right? I would never say it's not. So sometimes engaging with other human beings is a big dharmic gate, right? Interpersonal experiences can be really challenging. That doesn't mean that doesn't happen in a Sangha, but my hope is we all aspire to be kind with each other, right? To be skillful with each other. This is where we learn to do that. Then I hope we take it out into the world. Right? Other things in the room? You and then you. Rotoku and then Hoshi.
Yeah, well, I'm going to build on this because I've had experiences along this. I understand, Zazen is not therapy, but Zazen can be therapeutic.
Zazen can have beneficial results, but we don't go into Zazen as a therapy.
Right. When I, several years ago, at a monastic retreat, I was in what I felt was pretty deep samadhi, and all of a sudden my mind just became flooded with these very traumatic memories that I had suppressed for a very long time. And I had a severe panic attack, jumped off my cushion, went running through the Zendo to the bathroom, vomited, and it took several days before I could go back to sitting there. I left there shortly thereafter and went to another teacher that I knew had a background in psychotherapy, and I talked to him and worked things out that way. Then several years later, I was teaching a class on Buddhist philosophy, and we went into a Zendo, which I borrowed, the Indianapolis Zendo, and one of my students had a panic attack in the middle of Zazen, and I basically knew how to respond to that person because of the experience I'd had with panic attacks. Now, had I not practiced Zazen, that trauma might have remained buried.
Yep.
Because the quietness of the mind allows an awareness that you may not otherwise have.
Absolutely.
And that can be a first step toward a therapeutic resolution to the problem.
Yes. Absolutely. Well, I mean, so you're giving us a prime example of how, you know, we don't want to look at our own suffering. If it's pretty deep suffering, it's certainly true that we sit Zazen and things will happen that we don't expect. We'll remember things that we don't expect. I've certainly told the story of sitting a solo retreat. My mother had been dead 5 years, and I sat this retreat, and I'm all day long doing Zazen, and suddenly I was doing a whole grieving process for her all over again. You know, I was like, where did that come from? So we sometimes have experiences in Zazen. Something comes up, I'm like, gosh, where did that come from? I hadn't thought about that in years, or I don't want to think about that, right? You can have a physical reaction to that, right? So most of the time, you know, the good news is we're sitting Zazen, these things come up. It's a safe place for those things to come up because we're not going to act on them. If I suddenly feel angry, I'm not going to get up and make an angry phone call, right? We can experience those things in a safe way. But yes, sometimes those things happen. And yeah, it was helpful. I think it's good that you were able to turn that around so that you could help somebody else, right? You could liberate somebody else. You could help somebody else with that same kind of experience. Yeah, those things happen. They do. It's not frequent, but they do. Yeah.
I just wanted to say, it occurs to me that there are days when I feel like I am dealing with the 84,000. And it can be both good and bad, but the difference is that I'm paying attention. I might start the morning with proper Zazen and all that, and then it sort of seems to be actually kind of a somatic experience where it's within my body, or just sitting, feeling my breath, and then all of a sudden it's like the gate opens. And I feel like there are so many things that are like that. Anyway, maybe you can speak to that.
Well, I think it's important, I think you're recognizing something important, so we can start the morning in the Zendo, doing what you're calling proper Zazen, right? But that's not where the practice ends. Because we're doing Zazen with this body and mind, and then we're taking this body and mind out into the world. So if we can approach the day with the understanding that everything we encounter, all our situations, everything is an opportunity to practice, that can be helpful. What we have to, I think that as an idea can be overwhelming. What do you mean I have to be practicing every moment? What do you mean I have to be focusing on everything, as an opportunity to practice because I can't do my job because I'm concerned that every paperclip I pick up is a dharma gate, right? I mean, you couldn't function that way. So it has to be something it's just part of your worldview, part of your outlook, right? To just go through the world as though you were in the Zendo doing your practice with the same body and mind, right? One of the reasons I think, things like forms here can be helpful. We learn how to be in this body. We learn how to pay attention. And for me, for someone like me, that's incredibly helpful because I live in my head. I pay no attention to my body. It's all up here. So to have to pay attention to what is going on with this body is helpful. I notice after sesshin, when I go home, I move differently. I walk differently. There's much more groundedness there. It takes 3, 4, 5 days, right, to get out of my head and to see clearly and to be like an integrated whole person and not just living here. Right? So I think you're raising an important thing. How do we go through the day? Not just proper morning zazen. How do we go through the day seeing these 84,000 dharma gates and yet not being swept away by the enormity of that? If we're doing that, we just have an idea about what practice is, right? I've created this idea that I'm going to be a wonderful practitioner and, practice every moment of the day. Well, that's still my story. We need to just do. Other things in the room here? How about folks at home? Maybe Sawyer, you want to moderate for me and see if anybody has something to offer or ask? I don't see any hands. Please, Tony?
Well, 2 parts, I guess. A question for me is, just what you said, and you explained it to the person that's dealing with depression or whatever it is. I can't help you. Goodbye.
Well, okay, not going to say it exactly like that, but
No, but it's. I mean, okay, you're not going to say it. Well, how would you say it?
well, so when somebody asks to speak with me privately because they've got various kinds of suffering, we have to identify what the suffering is. And often one of the early things I will ask is, are you getting some health care? Right? There are ways to practice in the midst of that, but if somebody is really suffering and is under somebody's care, or should be under somebody's care, I'm not opposed to actually talking to that caregiver and saying, how can we work together? What kind of practice do you think is actually appropriate? What would be helpful? What's contraindicated? Right? How do we find a way for someone to practice? Because it could be, there's times where sitting facing a wall is really contraindicated, but somebody might have a very meaningful experience doing kinhin, doing walking, right? And it might not be walking in a zendo, it might be that person is taking a walk in the park outside for half an hour a day with zazen in mind, because somehow moving the body, feeling your feet on the ground is a grounding experience that keeps you here, right? So I guess my point about all of that is I don't claim to be an expert on what that person needs. I would want to work with somebody so we could get multiple perspectives. So it's not that that person can't practice. We need to find a way for that person to practice. Right? So I can't help you resolve your trauma from the point of view of a psychotherapist. That's not my training. And if you're working with a healthcare professional, I'm happy to talk to that person and say, what would be the best situation? I just want to be careful not to set myself up or set Sanshin up as a place where you come in and you sort of magically resolve those things. Because sometimes people really need skilled help. We have people in this room who are trained to give that kind of help. That's not me. Right? So, there's a way to practice. We need to find the skillful way to practice. You had something else. Another part of the question.
Well, it's semi-anecdotal when back in the early days in San Francisco, there were more than a few mentally off folks who used to come to the door and come in. And it was a problem there was more than a few. And at the time, Suzuki, I guess it was, what he did was the first woman he ordained, I forget her name, Italian name, but her job, but what he asked her to do was shepherd these people.
Mm.
So, so the same people who would, for example, follow behind him wherever he was going, and they go into the building, and they follow behind him. And I think I saw this, or I definitely heard it. But this person was yammering to Suzuki all the way. He got to the door, went in and closed the door with the guy on the outside. And he went on up. And then he also had the woman, young woman, to shepherd these. It was at least a half a dozen. And she did it for a year, turned her robes in and went to graduate school to be a social worker. But along these same lines, a similar question, I thought, I tried to couch it, anyway, long story short, I happened to be talking with, I had a chance to talk to Yasutani Roshi when he was making those visits. And I tried to set it up so, you couldn't wiggle out or something. I don't know what I mean by that exactly. What do you do with this or this or that? And what he told me was a great relief. He said, it cannot be helped. There's some things we can't help.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for me, to hear it from an authority like him, it was just, oh.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that's just part of what, you're discussing.
Yes. Well, so, people come to the Zendo looking for relief from various kinds of suffering. And, sometimes folks will come to Zen practice because they've been told they need to do anger management, or because they're worried they need therapy, or there's some kind of social stigma around some of those things, whereas if you say you're practicing Buddhism, well, that's cool, that's exotic, right? That doesn't sort of, people might have some strange feeling about that, but it's not like saying, well, I'm going to therapy, or I'm going to anger management, or I'm seeing my therapist, or something, right? So they want to start here. I don't mean here literally. They want to start with Zen practice, because maybe that's another way, maybe that's a better way. I think we have some responsibility, though, to help people, to be clear about what we can offer, to be clear about what practice is, right? And then maybe help people find other resources, although that's also not what we do here. I would never want to set up Sanchin as a human service agency because we're not qualified for that, right? But I think we do have a responsibility to say this is what practice is about. Practice is not therapy. Zazen is good for nothing, right? So we don't set up some expectation that all kinds of suffering will magically be lifted, right? There are some things we can't help. There are some things nobody can help, but there are some things we can't help, right? And I think it's really tempting in an effort to be welcoming, or in an effort to get as many people into the Zendo as possible, to say, yes, we'll take everybody. Well, there are people who should not be sitting Zazen, like for their own well-being right now. That doesn't mean they can't ever sit. It just means right now, this is not the time and place, right? This is not what you need to be doing. The same for Sesshin. Even if you can manage 30 minutes of Zazen or 50 minutes of Zazen, not everybody should be sitting Sesshin 14 hours a day looking at a wall. That, we've actually started to say, Sawyer and I, as we describe these things on the website, we've started to say, if your response to Sesshin conditions is panic, don't put yourself through that, right? This isn't the time and circumstance for you, but there are other ways to practice, right? The very next sentence always says, but there's other ways to practice, right? There's other things you can do to investigate the Dharma, to settle body and mind, right? But let's do that skillfully. So, yeah, there are some things that we can't help. Anything else this morning from anybody? Please, as someone trained to offer help.
Give us some therapy.
Or maybe you have some other question. I shouldn't pigeonhole you. My apologies for doing that.
I was trying to be very overt, but I do have an idea. So I was having a conversation with somebody a week or two ago, like a friend of mine, and this is actually kind of based on an anecdote you really like to give or took about the missionary or the monk who goes up to Tibet and he encounters like angry mountain spirits or something, and he preaches the Dharma, they turn and heal, right?
Dharma-illumination.
That's something that, like, just personally, I think is very beautiful, like really amazing. So both professionally and also just personally, like something I really find a lot of passion in is like trying to find the perpetrators, find the wrongdoers, and like figure it out, right? So for that reason, I try to specialize with sexual offenders. So I was talking about that, a friend of mine, and it turns out, I didn't know this, that they have a sexual trauma history. So when I'm talking about, this is something I really want to do, they get angry, they get very like indignant, like, these people don't deserve it, they don't, this isn't, they're not redeemable, this sort of thing. The thing that occurred to me is that person, that friend of mine is probably way better at taking care of other victims than I would be, right? Because, if I'm trying to take care of some sort of victim, they're going to kind of know on some level that maybe I'm going to apologize for their offender, right? Or I'm going to like try to make it okay in a way that like isn't for them, right? So I give this anecdote because it's a different way of framing what like trauma is, right? It's something that can actually help us be compassionate, help us be good for each other, right? So when we talk about like resolving trauma and using Zazen to do that, like I don't know. I think it can help us see it more clearly, maybe see it in a way that helps us be compassionate. But I don't know about this like framing of resolving, either through therapy or through Zazen, really. But the question I did have was there a particular gate that was really helpful for your own discernment?
Among the 108? Oh, that's interesting. Well, and partly that's interesting because now having gotten through the end of 109 talks on this text, you may know I'm also going back and doing a weekly essay on each one of them that gets posted on the website, and I'm up to like 40. So you'd think I had just looked at all of these. That would be one. I can't think of one that particularly stands out. I have to say, though, what was really useful to me about taking on this text was that I didn't get to choose the topics of my Dharma talks, right? Which meant I was forced to do discernment about things I would never have investigated. And the way these statements are written, they're always an intersection of two things. Such and so is a Dharma gate because with it, such and so. And sometimes you look at those two things and you go, those don't fit, right? So to have to really look at that intersection and say, why are these things connected? And sometimes it's not clear until you go back and look at the kanji, or even before the kanji, right? It's like, oh, this is being translated like this, but it's like that, right? So to have to look at like the intersections of those things was really helpful. So for instance, even these last 107, 108, 109, I was kind of looking forward. I knew I was going to have to investigate this whole wisdom water thing, water on the head, right? Because who talks about that, right? I didn't know that much about that. I thought, oh, I'm going to get to investigate and kind of get down to what that is. So I would say along the way, I've had to investigate things I wouldn't have otherwise, also because this text, in its original form, is not necessarily a Mahayana text. So it talks about, like, we don't talk that much about the Brahma Viharas. So it's good that we did that, right? So we've got a much bigger context, right? So let me think about that and come back to it. I don't know that there was, I can't point to one today that particularly went, oh, but it happened a lot just because I was intersecting things that didn't appear to be connected. And I gotta say, it's really satisfying when you go, oh, it's like this. Oh, I get it, because I can't explain it to you if I don't get it, right? So it was like when I figured that out, oh, I get it, right? Like even just today, I had to email Todo-san just the other day a question about this talk today. It's like, I don't get how this is like this. And of course, as soon as he pointed it out to me, I went, ah, of course. It was like that all the time. Right? So I think the fact, I don't think it's one gate that was meaningful for me. I think it was the fact that there was a series of gates and I had to look at the way the gates were created. That was my gate, right? Thank you for that. That's interesting. I got to do some discernment about that.
I think that's what you for me, that's what you seem to be demonstrating. I probably heard the second half of the 109 gates, but that seemed to be one of the messages, is that was watching you hone an approach to doing that. And that itself was a presentation.
Yeah, you know what, I was kind of fearful to go back and look again at 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I thought, I've learned a lot in these 8 years, right? I teach differently now, partly because I've had to investigate these gates. I thought, I'm going to go back and look at those first ones and be so embarrassed. because it's going to show me what a shallow understanding I had and how I didn't, teach very well. So it's been a bit of a redemption for me to go back and look at those early ones and have to write something now and put it out today and say, what would I say about this differently, right? So yes, I do think the gate was actually getting through the 109 and continuing to sort of refine my voice as a teacher and do that background and have to explain things. My point with these 108 was always to try to present them to you through the lens of our 20th century ancestors, because I think that's what we offer in the national conversation. What did Sawaki Roshi have to say? What did Uchiyama Roshi have to say? What did Todosan have to say? That positions our understanding of these gates, because I think that's really the juicy exploration for us, right? Part of our own style. Like, what does it mean in our own style? I can talk about something that happened in early Buddhism, but like, what does it mean for our practice today? How do we put these things on the ground? So, too much about me, but yeah, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to really dig into those 109, because I learned a lot. And partly what I learned was how to present them. So, coming from an instructor. This guy's a professional instructor, so he knows whereof he speaks. Other things this morning? Comments, questions, reflections, things we should talk
We have a
about?
bell you want to hit it 108 times?
Pardon me?
We have a bell you want to hit it 108
At
times?
New Year's. We'll do it at New Year's. It takes a long time. It'll take another hour to ring that 108 times. All right. Okay? Okay. So, thanks for going with me on this journey of 109 Dharma gates. I learned something. I hope you did too. Let's continue to practice together and do our very best.